The air in Boise didn't smell like a capital city. It smelled like a slaughterhouse flavored with incense. I leaned against the soot-stained bricks of the palace garden wall, my fingers digging into the mortar. Below me, the courtyard of the Scott kingdom was a sea of black silk and polished armor. They were all there, the high lords with their silver-tipped canes, the priests in their bone-white robes, and the commoners huddling at the gates, their breath visible in the biting autumn air. In the center of it all sat the pyre. It was a monstrous thing, built of cedar and soaked in oils that shimmered like oil spills under the midday sun. And atop it, laid out on a slab of cold marble, was Alpha King Aron Scott. "He looks peaceful," a woman whispered beside me. She was a merchant's wife, her eyes red from crying, like he's already gone. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My healer's eye, the curse and gift my grandmother Tammy had beaten into me since I was 5, was screaming. I wasn't looking at his peace. I was looking at the way his jugular vein was pulsing. It was rhythmic, too rhythmic. "Watch, Eileen," Grams used to say. "The body never lies, even when the soul is trying to." Aron Scott was 43. He was a titan, a man who had ended the great border wars and unified the packs. They said his wolf was so large it cast a shadow over entire villages. Now, he was being discarded like a broken tool. I looked at his chest. To the nobles, he looked still. To the priests, he looked ready for the great shift. But I saw the way his diaphragm hitched every 4th second. It was the soldier's brace, a breathing technique used to manage agonizing internal trauma. "He's not dead," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "Of course he isn't," the merchant's wife snapped, wiping her nose. "The ritual requires him to be alive for the transition. The fire takes the weakness, and the spirit passes to the air." She pointed to the front of the pyre. There stood Aron Scott. He was younger, sharper, and wearing the ceremonial cloak of succession. He looked like a man who had already won the lottery and was just waiting for the check to clear. But I wasn't looking at Brian. I was looking at the king's fingernails. Even from 20 feet up on a wall, I could see the faint, bluish-purple tint under the beds. My heart hammered against my ribs. That wasn't the pallor of a fading alpha. That was nightstalk. It's a rare, paralyzing toxin derived from the roots of the black briar. It mimics organ failure. It shuts down the vocal cords first, then the motor functions, but it leaves the mind perfectly, terrifyingly awake. Aron Scott wasn't dying of a broken spirit. He was being buried alive while his court watched and cheered. The head priest stepped forward, a torch of sacred fire held high. The flames were a violent, hungry orange. "The wolf returns to the flame," the priest bellowed. "The crown returns to the blood." The crowd let out a low, rhythmic chant. I looked at Aron. His eyes were closed, but I saw a single tear track through the dirt on his temple. He knew. He was lying there, paralyzed, watching his own execution through his eyelids, unable to even scream. My grandmother always said that healing isn't about power. It's about attention. And if I didn't pay attention right now, a king was going to burn for a lie. I didn't think about my status as an unranked nobody. I didn't think about the fact that I had no pack, no name, and no right to be within a mile of the royal dais. I only thought about the satchel at my hip, containing the vial of crushed star lily I'd prepared for a merchant's sick horse 2 days ago. Star lily, the only known neutralizer for nightstalk. The priest lowered the torch toward the oil-soaked wood. "Wait," I didn't scream it. I didn't have time. I pushed off the wall. The fall was 12 feet. I hit the ground in a roll, the breath leaving my lungs in a sharp woof. I didn't stop. I was a blur of brown wool and frantic motion. I sprinted through the line of royal guards, men who were so distracted by the solemnity of the moment, they didn't expect a girl with dirt on her face to charge the king. "Stop her." Brian's voice cracked through the air. I reached the pyre just as the first lick of flame touched the cedar. The heat hit my face like a physical hand, singeing my eyelashes. I didn't jump away. I jumped on. I scrambled up the logs, the oil slicking my boots. I threw myself across Aron Scott's massive, motionless chest, shielding him with my own body. "He's poisoned," I shrieked, my voice echoing off the stone walls of the palace. "The king isn't dying. He's being murdered." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum. It was the sound of 20,000 people holding their breath at the exact same time. I looked down. Aron's eyes snapped open. Gold. They were the purest, most terrifying gold I had ever seen. And in that moment, as the smoke began to rise around us, the air between us didn't just feel hot from the fire. It felt like it was vibrating. I felt a pull in my chest, a tether I didn't know existed, snapping taut with enough force to break my ribs. Oh, God, I thought, staring into the eyes of the man I had just desecrated. What have I done? Get her off him. The voice belonged to Brian, and it was no longer the voice of a grieving cousin. It was the snarl of a predator who had just seen his dinner run away. Two guards, clad in the heavy charcoal plate of the Scott elite, lunged for the pyre. I felt their hands on my shoulders, rough, metallic, and cold. They yanked me backward, my boots dragging against the logs. No! Look at his eyes! I screamed, kicking out. My heel caught a guard in the visor, and I felt a satisfying jar up my leg. He's in there. He's conscious. If you light this pyre, you are regicides. The head priest froze, the torch trembling in his hand. He looked at Aron. The king's eyes were still open, fixed on the sky, wide and frantic. She's a mad woman, Brian spat, stepping forward. He reached for the torch himself. A rogue, an unranked piece of filth trying to disrupt the sacred transition. Execute her on the spot and finish the rite. The king's soul is already departing. These are the death spasms of the flesh. Death spasms don't track movement. I lunged forward again, breaking the grip of one guard. I reached into my satchel and pulled out the small glass vial. The liquid inside was a murky, iridescent silver. This is the antidote. If I'm wrong, kill me. But if I'm right, and you light that fire, you're burning your king for a lie. Enough. The voice came from the back of the dais. Elder Kale, the oldest living member of the High Council. He hobbled forward, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. He looked at me, then at the king, then at the vial in my hand. You are a healer? Kale asked. Eileen Murphy, unranked. I was trained by Tammy Murphy of the Eastern Border, I said, my voice shaking but clear. Kale's eyes flickered. Tammy's granddaughter. I knew the woman. She didn't raise fools. He looked at the guards. Release her. Lord Kale, this is a violation of... Brian started. This is a violation of nothing if the king is alive, Brian. Kale snapped. He turned to me. Administer it. If he dies, your life is forfeit. If he lives, we shall have a very long conversation. The guards stepped back, though their hands stayed on their sword hilt. I climbed back onto the marble slab. The smell of the oil was nauseating. I knelt beside Aron. Up close, he was even more imposing. His skin was like carved granite, his jawline sharp enough to cut. I could feel the heat radiating off him, not from the fire, but from the sheer power of an alpha's biology fighting the toxin. I leaned close to his ear. I'm going to pour this down your throat. You need to swallow. I know it's hard. I know you feel like you're made of stone, but you have to fight, Alpha. As I spoke, the pull returned. It was a magnetic thrumming in my blood, a humming frequency that seemed to synchronize my heartbeat with his. It was dizzying. I pried his jaw open. It was locked tight, and poured the silver liquid in. Swallow, I whispered. I massaged his throat, forcing the muscles to react. For a long, terrifying minute, nothing happened. Brian was smirking. The priest was praying. The crowd was beginning to murmur about blasphemy. Then Aron Scott coughed. It was a wet, ragged sound. His hand, the size of a dinner plate, suddenly twitched. His fingers curled into the marble. Then, with a groan that sounded like tectonic plates shifting, he turned his head and spat a mouthful of black bile onto the funeral pyre. The golden eyes found mine again. This time they weren't just terrified. They were focused. He lives, the priest whispered, dropping the torch into the dirt. Aron's hand reached out. It moved slowly, as if through water. He didn't grab my arm. He didn't reach for his sword. He reached for my face. His thumb brushed my cheek, a touch so light it was almost a question. You, he rasped. His voice sounded like it had been dragged over broken glass. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Take him to the infirmary, Kale shouted, breaking the spell. And take the girl. Keep her under heavy guard. No one, and I mean no one, speaks to her without my permission. As the guards swarmed the pyre to lift their king, I was pulled away. But I kept looking back, and even as they carried him, Aron Scott's head was turned, his golden eyes locked onto me until the palace doors slammed shut between us. I was an unranked girl from a village that didn't matter, and I had just slapped the hand of death away from the most powerful man in the world. My grandmother was wrong about one thing. Sometimes, attention is the most dangerous power there is. The infirmary wing of the Scott Palace didn't smell like the village clinics I was used to. There was no scent of drying eucalyptus or the earthy musk of crushed comfrey. It smelled of ozone, expensive wax, and the sterile, sharp bite of alchemical salts. They had locked me in a room adjacent to the king's recovery suite. The walls were thick, gray granite, and the only window was a narrow slit high above that showed nothing but a sliver of the darkening Boise sky. I sat on the edge of a velvet-covered cot that felt far too soft to be comfortable. My hands were shaking. I clamped them between my knees, trying to still the tremors. I was a healer. I dealt in pulses and temperatures in the predictable physics of the human and werewolf body. But what had happened on that pyre wasn't physics. It was something older. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that pull. It wasn't a thought, it was a physical sensation, like a hook buried deep in my sternum, tethered to a weight in the next room. It was a rhythmic thrumming that matched the heavy, slow beat of a heart that wasn't mine. Fated mate. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. In the border villages, we told stories of the bond. We called it the Great Anchor. To the unranked, it was a fairy tale. To the nobility, it was a political nuclear strike. But for me, for a girl who had spent 23 years making sure she was invisible, it felt like a death sentence. The heavy oak door groaned on its hinges. I bolted upright, my hand instinctively reaching for the empty space where my medical satchel usually hung. They had taken it. Of course they had. A woman entered. She wasn't a guard. She wore the deep crimson robes of a royal physician, her gray hair pulled back into a knot so tight it looked painful. She carried a tray of broth and a roll of clean linen. "Eat," she said. Her voice was like parchment rubbing together. "The council is still debating whether to hang you for treason or build you a statue. In the meantime, the king's blood must not be on a starving girl's conscience." "How is he?" I asked, ignoring the tray. The physician, whose name tag read Dr. Eris, paused. She looked at me with a mixture of professional resentment and genuine curiosity. "The night stalk is clearing. His wolf is agitated. He refused the sedative. He nearly broke a guard's arm when they tried to move him closer to the wall." "Which wall?" I asked, though I already knew. Eris gestured vaguely toward the partition separating our rooms. "This one. He's been staring at the stone for 6 hours. He hasn't said a word to the council, or the high priest, or even his cousin Brian." A cold shiver raced down my spine. Brian shouldn't be allowed near him. Eris arched a silver eyebrow. "Careful, girl. That is the heir to the throne you're accusing." He was smirking, I snapped, the healer's heat rising in my chest. When the king was choking on his own tongue, Aron Scott was calculating the weight of the crown. "I saw it. I see people. That's what I do." "Then see yourself out of a noose," Eris whispered, stepping closer. "The palace is a den of vipers, Eileen Murphy. You've stepped on the biggest one's tail. If the king recovers, you're a hero. If he relapses, Brian will have your head on a pike before the sun sets." She left without another word, the bolt sliding home with a finality that made the room feel like a tomb. I didn't eat the broth. I paced. 1, 2, 3 steps, turn. 1, 2, 3 steps. The sun vanished, leaving the room in a thick, velvety darkness. I felt the pressure in my chest intensifying. It was becoming a dull ache, a localized fever. My wolf, small, gray, and usually as quiet as a mouse, was pacing in the back of my mind, scratching at the cage of my ribs. She wanted out. She wanted to get to the source of that gold light resonance. "Stop it," I hissed to myself. "He's a king. You're a ghost. This is a mistake of the blood." Around midnight, the silence changed. The sound of the guard's heavy boots outside my door stopped. There was no scuffle, no shout, just a sudden terrifying absence of noise. Then the bolt didn't slide, it snapped. The metal sheared off as if it were made of tin. The door swung open. Aron Scott stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his royal regalia. He was draped in a simple black tunic that was unbuttoned at the throat, revealing the tanned, corded muscles of his neck. He was pale, yes, and he leaned slightly against the doorframe, but the sheer presence of him was suffocating. He didn't just walk into a room, he reordered the space around him. I backed away until my calves hit the cot. You should be in bed." The night stalk has a secondary phase. It causes cardiac. "Quiet," he rasped. His voice was deeper than I remembered. It vibrated in the floorboards. He stepped into the room, and the air seemed to vanish. He was tall, impossibly tall, and the moonlight from the high window caught the gold in his eyes. They were glowing, not the way a predator's eyes glow in the dark, but with a steady, ancient heat. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at me. It wasn't a look of gratitude. It was a look of profound, agonizing recognition. It was the look a man gives a map he's been trying to read for 20 years. 17 years, he whispered. I shook my head, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm from the East. I've never been to Boise. I've never seen you. I have seen you, he said, taking a step closer. The tether in my chest snapped taut, pulling me toward him. I had to grip the edge of the cot to keep from stumbling forward. Every time I closed my eyes to sleep, every time I stood on a battlefield and wondered why I was fighting to survive when there was nothing to come home to, I felt the shadow of you. It's the bond, I said, trying to find my healer's voice, the one that was clinical and detached. It's a biological imperative. Your wolf is confused because I saved your life. It's a proximity response to the trauma. Aron laughed. It was a dark, dry sound. You're trying to diagnose me, Eileen? I'm trying to stay sane, Alpha. He moved then, faster than a man recovering from poison had any right to move. Before I could blink, he was in my space. He didn't touch me, but he hovered just inches away. I could smell him, cedarwood, rain, and the metallic tang of old magic. My healers told me I was dying, he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. They told me the Scott line was fading. They stood around my bed for weeks and watched me rot. But you saw me through a stone wall. You saw me from the top of a garden fence. I saw a man who was breathing wrong, I whispered. No, he said. He reached out, his hand hovering near my throat. I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. You felt me, just as I feel you now. Your heart is beating at 110 beats per minute. Your scent is shifting from fear to something else. You are an unranked Murphy from a border village, and yet you carry the scent of the high wilds. I froze. My mother was from the wilds. Aron's eyes flared. I know, because I met her 17 years ago at the Gray Pass. She was running. She was carrying a secret wrapped in a healer's cloak. The room felt like it was spinning. My grandmother had told me my mother died of a wasting sickness. She told me my father was a traveler who didn't know we existed. She told me we were nobodies because being a nobody was safe. She wasn't running from a sickness, Aron said, his voice softening. She was running from this. She felt the bond begin to form with a young king, and she knew what the court would do to a woman of the wilds. She knew the politics, the assassinations, the weight of the Scott crown. She chose to make you a nobody, to keep you alive. You're lying, I breathed, though every cell in my body was screaming that he was telling the truth. I spent 3 years searching for her, he continued, ignoring my protest. And then I spent 14 years believing the bond had broken because she was gone. I accepted my death on that pyre because I thought there was no one left to hold the other end of the chain. He finally closed the distance. His hand cupped my jaw. His skin was scorching. The moment his thumb touched my skin, a jolt of pure white-hot electricity shot through me. My wolf howled, not in fear, but in a joyous, terrifying surrender. The world outside, the guards, the conspiracy, the poison, the kingdom, it all vanished. There was only the gold of his eyes and the crushing weight of a destiny I had never asked for. I am not my mother, I said, my voice cracking. I don't want a crown. I don't want to be a piece in your game. I saved you because it was the right thing to do, not because I belong to you. Aron leaned in until his forehead touched mine. You don't belong to me, Eileen. We belong to the bond, and the bond has just told the entire kingdom that the Alpha King is no longer alone. He pulled back, his expression turning grim. The king was back, the vulnerability masked by stone. Brian knows, the council knows. You are the most dangerous person in this palace now, Eileen, because as long as you breathe, I cannot be replaced, and as long as I live, they cannot touch you. They'll try, I said, thinking of Brian's smirk. Let them, Aron growled. He turned toward the broken door. Dr. Eris will be here in a moment to move you to the royal apartments. Do not resist her. From this moment on, you are not a guest, and you are not a prisoner. Then what am I? Aron looked back over his shoulder, his golden eyes burning through the dark. You are the reason this kingdom is about to burn, because I am going to find whoever put that poison in my veins, and I am going to show them what happens when you try to kill a man who has finally found his mate." He left, and for the first time in my life, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating pause before a storm that would tear the world apart. I sank onto the bed, staring at my shaking hands. I had stumbled into a funeral pyre to save a stranger. But as I felt the ghostly imprint of Aron's touch on my face, I realized the truth. The fire hadn't even started yet. The royal apartments were not a room, they were a statement. If the infirmary was a tomb of stone, this was a cathedral of gold and obsidian. The floors were polished dark marble that reflected the flickering candlelight like a haunted lake. Tapestries depicting the Scott lineage, great wolves with eyes of amber, hung from the vaulted ceilings. I stood in the center of the vast chamber, my mud-stained boots looking like a desecration against the white fur rugs. "You should bathe," Dr. Eris said from the doorway. She hadn't left my side since Aron broke my door down. Her eyes were wary now, no longer looking at me as a stray healer, but as a ticking time bomb. "The council meets at dawn. The king has demanded your presence." "I'm not a noble," I said, my voice sounding small against the high walls. "I don't belong at a council table." "You belong wherever the king's blood says you belong," Eris countered. She stepped forward, dropping a bundle of silk onto a nearby chaise. "The unranked girl who climbed the pyre is dead, Eileen. The woman who saved the Alpha is all that's left. Dress like it." I didn't argue. I couldn't. The exhaustion was finally starting to settle into my marrow, a heavy, dragging weight that made my eyes burn. I bathed in a tub carved from a single block of jade, the water smelling of crushed jasmine and something sharper, something meant to mask the scent of a wolf. As I scrubbed the soot from under my fingernails, I felt it. The tether. It wasn't a dull ache anymore. It was a vibrating wire. Aron was close, not in the room, but somewhere nearby, pacing the length of his own suite. I could feel his agitation, a low-frequency growl in my own nervous system. When his heart rate spiked, mine followed. When he took a deep, stabilizing breath, my own lungs seemed to expand. It was invasive. It was a theft of my own autonomy. Is this what my mother felt? I wondered, submerged in the hot water. This terrifying loss of I in favor of we. I dressed in the clothes they provided, a deep forest green tunic of heavy silk and trousers of supple black leather. It was practical but expensive, the color of the eastern woods I had called home. I refused the jewelry. I kept my grandmother's simple iron ring on my finger. It was the only thing I had left that felt real. At dawn, 2 guards, not the ones from the pyre, but older men with scarred faces and the king's personal crest on their chests, escorted me to the council chamber. The room was circular, a theater of power. 12 high-backed chairs surrounded a table of ancient oak. Aron Scott sat to the right of the king's empty throne, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the wood. The other nobles, men and women whose names carried the weight of centuries, spoke in hushed, jagged whispers. When I entered, the whispers died. Every pair of eyes in that room turned on me. It wasn't the look of a crowd watching a hero. It was the look of a pack of wolves watching a strange creature enter their territory, one they couldn't decide whether to worship or tear apart. "Eileen Murphy," Lord Kale said, standing from his seat. He looked tired, the lines on his face deeper in the morning light. "Please, sit." He gestured to a chair at the far end of the table. I didn't sit. I stayed standing, my hands clasped behind my back in the way Grams taught me when dealing with angry village elders. "I prefer to stand," I said. Brian let out a sharp, mocking breath. "The Unranked has manners. How charming. Tell me, Eileen, did you plan the theatrical entrance on the pyre, or was the poisoning something you dreamed up to ensure a royal audience?" "The poison was nightstock, Lord Brian," I said, my voice cutting through his sarcasm like a scalpel. "Derived from blackbriar root. If I had dreamed it up, the king would be a corpse right now, and you would be wearing a crown that smells of murder." The room went ice cold. 2 nobles gasped. Brian's face flushed a violent shade of red, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You dare." "I dare speak the truth because I have nothing to lose," I interrupted. "I didn't come here for your gold or your titles. I came here with a merchant caravan to heal sick horses. I saw a man dying because your own royal physicians couldn't tell the difference between a failing heart and a paralyzed one. That is enough, a new voice boomed. The heavy double doors at the head of the room swung open. Aron Scott walked in. He was dressed in full alpha regalia, black leather armor reinforced with silver, a cloak of gray wolf fur draped over one shoulder. He looked like the god of war. He didn't look sick. He looked lethal. He didn't look at the council. He walked straight to me. The tether in my chest surged. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, wild thing. As he reached me, he paused. He didn't touch me, but he stood so close I could feel the heat of his body. He was claiming the space around me. He was telling the room without a single word that I was under his protection. Then he turned to the table and sat on the throne. "The girl is right," Aron said, his voice dropping like a heavy stone into a still pond. "I was poisoned. The night stock was administered over the course of 3 weeks. Small doses in my evening tea, just enough to mimic the wasting fever the Scots are known to suffer in their twilight years." "Alpha, we had no idea," one of the female nobles said, her voice trembling. The physicians were either incompetent or bought," Aron snapped. "I suspect both. But we are not here to discuss my health. We are here to discuss the succession." He looked at Brian. The silence in the room became unbearable. "The transition ritual was nearly completed," Aron continued. "By all rights, if the fire had been lit, Brian would be king, and I would be ashes." "I would never," Brian started, his voice cracking. "I believe you," Aron said, though his eyes remained hard as flint. "You are too arrogant to be a poisoner, Brian. You prefer to win your battles in the light. But someone used you. Someone fed you the lie that I was fading. Someone pushed you toward that cloak of succession." Aron leaned forward, his hands flat on the oak table. "And they did it because they knew I had no mate. They knew the Scott line ended with me. They thought they could restart the clock with a new king who owed them everything." He paused, his gaze drifting to me. "They were wrong. The Scott line does not end with me because the bond has been recognized." The room erupted. It wasn't just noise, it was chaos. Nobles were shouting, chairs were scraping against the floor, and Lord Kale was frantically calling for order. "An unranked?" one man shouted. "It's impossible. The bloodlines wouldn't allow it. She has no pack, no lineage," another shrieked. Aron didn't shout. He didn't have to. He stood up, and the sheer force of his alpha presence, a wave of raw, crushing power, slammed into the room. The shouting stopped instantly. Some of the weaker-willed nobles actually lowered their heads, their wolves instinctively submitting to the dominance of their king. "She is the daughter of the woman of the Grey Pass," Aron said, his voice low and dangerous. "She is the blood of the High Wilds and the healer's spirit. The bond does not care about your tax brackets or your titles. It cares about the soul, and hers is the only one that matches mine." He looked at me, and for a second, the mask of the king slipped. I saw the man underneath, the one who had been lonely for 17 years. "Eileen Murphy saved my life," Aron said to the room, "and in doing so, she saved this kingdom. If any of you have a grievance with her status, you may bring it to me, on the training grounds, with steel." No one spoke. "Good," Aron said. He turned to me. "Eileen, come here." My legs felt like lead, but the tether pulled. I walked to the head of the table. Aron reached out and took my hand. His grip was firm, warm, and utterly possessive. He turned our joined hands toward the council. "The hunt for the poisoner begins now," he said. "And until they are found, Eileen Murphy stays by my side. She is my eyes, she is my healer, and she is your future queen." "I didn't agree to that," I whispered, loud enough only for him to hear. Aron didn't look at me. He just squeezed my hand. "You saved a king, Eileen. Now you have to survive the consequences." As the council was dismissed, I caught Brian's eye. He wasn't looking at Aron. He was looking at me. And in his eyes, I didn't see submission. I saw a cold, calculating hunger. The conspiracy wasn't over. It had just changed targets. The royal apartments felt less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully gilded cage as the days bled into one another. Outside, the Scott kingdom was a powder keg. Inside, I was the match. "You're doing it again," Aron's voice rumbled from the balcony. I started, nearly dropping the silver mortar and pestle I was using to grind dried valerian root. "Doing what?" Pacing like a trapped lynx, he said, stepping into the room. He had discarded his heavy armor for a simple linen shirt, but even in his relaxed state, he radiated a predatory grace that made the air in the room feel tight. The council is dismissed for the day. You are safe here. I am never safe here, I countered, set the mortar down with a sharp clack. Safe was a drafty cottage in a village where no one knew my name. Safe was healing bruised shins and birthing calves. Here I am a political pawn that everyone is trying to knock off the board. Aron walked toward me, his golden eyes tracking every micro-movement of my hands. The bond, the tether, pulsed with a low, warm hum. It was getting harder to ignore. It was no longer just a pull in my chest. It was a resonance. When he was frustrated, I felt a prickle of heat behind my eyes. When he was weary, my own limbs felt like lead. You are not a pawn, he said softly, stopping just a few inches from me. You are the queen consort in everything but name. I never asked for the name, Aron, or the crown. I looked up at him, my heart doing that frantic, fluttering dance it only did when he was this close. Why didn't you let me go? You told me I was free to leave, but you've surrounded me with guards and honorary titles. You're holding me here with a silken cord. Aron reached out, his fingers hovering just shy of my cheek. I'm holding you here because the moment you step outside those gates without my crest on your shoulder, you are a target. Brian's faction is growing bold. They're whispering that you bewitched me, that the Night Stalk was a play we coordinated to seize absolute power. I felt a cold shiver. They think I'd poison a king just to marry him? They think anyone would do anything for power, Aron said, his voice darkening, because that is the only language they speak. I turned away, staring at the rows of vials I had organized on the mahogany sideboard. I need to go to the lower markets. The palace apothecary is out of white willow bark, and the night stalk leaves a lingering inflammation in the joints. You're still limping when you think I'm not looking. Aron laughed, a genuine, low sound that vibrated in my marrow. You see too much, Eileen Murphy. I see what's there, and right now I see a man who is trying to rule a kingdom while his own blood is screaming at him to stop and breathe. He stepped closer, his chest nearly brushing my back. I could feel the heat radiating from him. The bond flared, a sudden, sharp surge of longing that wasn't entirely mine. He wanted to touch me. He wanted to pull me into the circle of his arms and shut the world out. And God help me, a part of me, the part that had been lonely since my mother died, wanted it too. Go to the markets, he whispered near my ear, but you take Harlan and Voss with you, and you stay in the sunlight. I can take care of myself, Alpha. I know you can, he said, finally letting his hand rest on my shoulder. The contact was electric. That's what terrifies me the most. Boise's lower market was a sensory assault. The smell of roasting meat, the tang of iron from the smithies, and the constant, underlying scent of thousands of werewolves packed into narrow stone streets. Harlan and Voss, two of Aron's most trusted elite guards, moved like shadows behind me. They were dressed in commoners' cloaks, but their posture gave them away. They were predators among sheep. I moved through the stalls, my hood pulled low. I was looking for Old Man Cillian, a hedge doctor who dealt in the rare herbs the royal gardens found too common to grow. Eileen? A voice hissed from a dark alleyway between a weaver's shop and a butcher. I froze. Harlan's hand went to the hilt of his concealed blade. Wait, I whispered to him. I knew that voice. A woman stepped out of the shadows. She was thin, her hair a matted nest of gray, but her eyes were sharp and clear. It was Moira, a woman from my village who had left 3 years ago to find work in the capital. Moira? What are you doing here? I asked, stepping toward her. Looking for you, she breathed, her eyes darting to the guards. They're saying you're the king's mate. They're saying you're the one who saved him from the fire. I did what I had to do, Moira. She grabbed my arm, her fingers trembling. Listen to me. You need to leave. Tonight, there are people, men in the old order. They know about your mother. They know why she ran. My blood turned to ice. What do you mean? Your mother didn't just run from the bond, Eileen, Moira whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the market. She ran because she saw the prophecy. The Scott line is cursed to end in fire. They say the fated mate of the last king will either save the realm or burn it to the ground. The old order, they believe it's burn. They won't let you reach the moon fasting ceremony. Who was they? I demanded. Before she could answer, a sharp thwip sliced through the air. Moira's eyes went wide. She let out a soft, wet gasp and slumped forward. A small, black-feathered bolt was buried in the back of her neck. "Sniper!" Harlan roared, lunging forward to catch me. He tackled me to the cobbles just as a second bolt whistled over my head, shattering a clay pot on a nearby stall. The market erupted into chaos. People were screaming, diving for cover, as the scent of panic filled the air. "Voss! East roof!" Harlan barked, pinning me down with his massive body. I looked at Moira. She was twitching, her eyes rolling back. I scrambled out from under Harlan, ignoring his shout of protest. I reached for her, my fingers pressing against her carotid artery. "She's poisoned," I gritted out. The skin around the wound was already turning that familiar bruised purple. The same as the king. It's night stalk, but a concentrated dose. I reached for my satchel, but I had left the star lily at the palace. I watched, helpless as the light faded from Moira's eyes. She had died trying to warn me. "Eileen, we have to go, now," Voss yelled, returning from the roof. He got away. He used a smoke bomb, alchemical, not standard. They dragged me to my feet. I was covered in Moira's blood and the filth of the street. I looked at the dark alley, at the place where a woman's life had been snuffed out just for knowing my name. The old order, the prophecy. Aron had told me I was safe. He had told me I was the reason the kingdom was being saved. But as we sprinted back toward the palace, the weight of the tether in my chest felt different. It felt heavy. It felt like a chain. I wasn't just his mate. I was the catalyst for an ancient war I didn't understand. When we burst back into the palace, Aron was already in the foyer, his face a mask of cold fury. He saw the blood on my tunic and let out a low, guttural growl that made the stone floor vibrate. He moved toward me, his hands reaching out to check for wounds. "I'm fine," I said, pushing his hands away. My voice was trembling, not with fear, but with a sudden, searing rage. "But Moira isn't. She's dead because of your old order, because of your prophecy." Aron went still. The gold in his eyes flickered. "How do you know about that?" "Because a woman died in the mud to tell me," I snapped. "You lied to me, Aron. You told me you were protecting me, but you're just waiting for the fire, aren't you? You're waiting to see if I'm the one who burns it all down." The silence in the hall was deafening. Aron looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flash of genuine pain in his expression. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want it to be true," he whispered. "Well, it's true enough for the assassins," I said, turning toward the stairs. "I'm up going to my room, and don't you dare follow me. The bond might make me feel your heart, Alpha, but it doesn't mean I have to like what I find there." I left him standing in the hall, the king of 3 kingdoms, looking more alone than he ever had on that funeral pyre. The royal wing was silent, but it was a jagged, predatory kind of quiet. I locked the heavy oak doors of my suite, leaning my forehead against the cool wood. My heart was a frantic bird, battering against the cage of my ribs, but it wasn't just my heart. Through the bond, I felt Aron. He was standing exactly where I had left him in the foyer. I could feel his stillness, a heavy, suffocating weight of guilt and burgeoning wrath. It was like standing in the shadow of a mountain right before an avalanche. I pushed away from the door and stripped off the blood-stained silk. My hands were stained with Moira's life. I scrubbed them in the basin until the skin was raw and pink, the scent of the alchemical poison still ghosting in my nostrils. Night stalk. It was the calling card of someone who wanted the king dead, and now they wanted his anchor gone too. Prophecy, I whispered to the empty, opulent room. I had spent my life treating the tangible, a broken bone, a fever, a laceration. Those things had rules. Prophecy was the medicine of fools and tyrants. Yet here I was, the unranked nobody, caught in the gears of a machine built centuries before I was born. A soft knock vibrated through the door. Not the booming command of the king, but a rhythmic, hesitant tapping. "Eileen?" "It's Eris." I opened the door. The royal physician looked older than she had this morning. She carried a leather-bound volume, its edges frayed and darkened by time. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation and set the book on the mahogany table. "The king is in the war room," she said, her voice low. "He's calling in the border generals. He thinks the assassination attempt is a precursor to a coup." "Is he wrong?" I asked, pulling a wool shawl over my shoulders. No, but he's distracted. His wolf is loud, Eileen. Even the guards can feel it. He's losing the coldness that makes him a king because he's terrified for you. She tapped the book. He wouldn't tell you about the cinder bond. He thinks if he doesn't name it, it won't happen. I sat across from her, my eyes fixed on the yellowed parchment. The woman in the market said the Scott line is cursed to end in fire. That I'm the one who lights it. Eris sighed, a long, weary sound. The prophecy says the last alpha of the Scott line will find a mate of the high wilds, the blood of the ancient healers. It says their union will be a conflagration. To some, that means a rebirth. To the old order, the families who ruled before the Scots unified the packs, it means the end of their world. They believe if they kill the mate, they kill the future. And Brian? Eris looked away. Brian is a Scot. He wants the throne, but I don't think he wants a graveyard. The people behind him, however, they are the ones who provided the Night Stalk. They are the ones who want to return to the era of warring tribes. I reached out and traced the ancient script in the book. It was written in the old tongue, but I recognized the symbols for life and ash intertwined. I need to see the king, I said suddenly. Eileen, he's in a rage. He won't listen to reason. I don't have reason, I said, standing up. I have to dote. The war room was a sunken chamber beneath the throne room, illuminated by a massive hearth and flickering sconces. A map of the three kingdoms was carved into the stone floor, with obsidian and ivory pieces representing the various pack strengths. When I reached the gallery overlooking the room, I stopped. Aron was standing over the map, his hands braced on a heavy stone table. Surrounding him were 5 generals, men with faces like scarred leather. Brian was there too, standing in the shadows near the hearth, his expression unreadable. I want the eastern passes closed, Aron growled. No one enters or leaves Boise without my personal seal. If the old order wants a war, I will give them one that leaves nothing but salt in their fields. Alpha, with respect, General Cray said. Closing the borders will strangle the trade routes. The people are already nervous about the girl. The girl has a name, Aron snapped, his head whipping around. The gold in his eyes was so bright it looked like liquid fire. And she is your queen. If you cannot protect her, you cannot protect the kingdom. She is a liability, a voice rang out from the corner. It was a noble I hadn't seen before, a tall, gaunt man in midnight blue velvet. Lord Vane. One of the heads of the old order. She is an unranked healer with a dead mother and a bloodline of ghosts, Vane continued, stepping into the light. The prophecy is clear, Aron. She is the spark. Why do you think the poison appeared the moment she arrived in the city? Perhaps she didn't save you from the pyre. Perhaps she staged the rescue to bind you to her. The room went deathly silent. Brian shifted his weight, his eyes flitting between Vane and his cousin. Aron moved so fast the human eye couldn't track it. In a heartbeat, his hand was around Vane's throat, lifting the nobleman off his feet. The generals backed away, their wolves whining in their chests at the sheer pressure of Aron's dominance. Repeat that, Aron whispered. It was a sound more terrifying than any roar. Repeat it so I have a reason to tear your tongue out. Aron, stop! I shouted from the gallery. Every head turned. I descended the stone stairs, my heart thumping in time with the pulse I felt from him. Hot, jagged, and out of control. Aron didn't let go of Vane, but his eyes found mine. The rage in them flickered, replaced by a desperate, agonizing hunger. Go back to your room, Eileen, he commanded. No. I walked right up to him, stepping into the circle of his heat. I ignored the gasps of the generals. I placed my hand on the arm that was crushing Vane's windpipe. You're doing exactly what they want. They want you to be a tyrant. They want you to be the fire they're so afraid of. He insulted you, Aron growled, his grip tightening. Vane's face was turning a sickly shade of gray. He's a fool, I said calmly. And you're a king. You don't kill fools, you outlast them. Now let him go, or I will leave this palace tonight, and the bond be damned. For a long second, I thought he wouldn't do it. The alpha in him was screaming for blood. But then, slowly his fingers uncurled. Vane dropped to the floor, gasping and clutching his throat. Aron turned to me, his chest heaving. They killed a woman to get to you, Eileen. My people. On my streets. Then find who did it, I said, my voice steady. But do it with your head, not your claws. You think I'm the spark? Fine. Then let me be the one to tell you how to put the fire out. I turned to the room, looking at the generals and the cowering Lord Vane. The poison used on the king and the woman in the market was the same, but the delivery was different. The king was poisoned slowly, through his tea. Moira was killed with a bolt. That means the poisoner has access to the royal kitchens and the alchemical stores of the military. I looked directly at Brian, and only a few people have the keys to both. Brian didn't flinch. You're accusing me again, healer? I'm narrowing the field, I said. Aron, you want to close the borders? Don't. Close the palace. No one leaves this stone circle until I've checked every hand for the scent of black briar. It stays on the skin for 48 hours, even with soap. It's a healer's secret. Aron looked at me, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. It wasn't the grin of a lover. It was the grin of a hunter who had just found a partner. You heard her, Aron said to the generals. Seal the palace. Collect every servant, every noble, and every guard in the Great Hall. The Queen has a test to perform. This is an outrage, Vane croaked from the floor. No, Aron said, stepping over him to stand by my side. This is the attention a king pays when his mate speaks. Move. As the room cleared, leaving only Aron and me in the flickering firelight, he reached out and took my hand. His skin was still hot, his pulse still high. You realized that was a lie, didn't you? I whispered. Black briar doesn't leave a scent on the skin after 10 minutes. Aron looked at me, his eyes softening into that terrifying, beautiful gold. I knew, but the person who did it doesn't. He pulled me closer, his forehead resting against mine. The tether was no longer a chain, it was a heartbeat. You're not the fire, Eileen, he murmured. You're the light I've been waiting for. Don't get poetic yet, Alpha, I said, though I leaned into him. We still have a murderer to catch. The Great Hall was a cavern of flickering shadows and stifling heat. Usually, this room was reserved for midwinter feasts and the swearing of blood oaths, but tonight it felt like a courtroom where the judge was a dead woman's memory. Hundreds of souls, nobles in their finery, kitchen scullions in stained aprons, and the elite guard in their charcoal plate, stood in rows that stretched into the darkness of the vaulted ceiling. The air was thick with the scent of frightened wolves. It was a sour, sharp smell that made the hair on my arms stand up. Aron stood on the dais above them, a silhouette of sheer, unrelenting power. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His presence was a physical weight, pressing down on every shoulder in the room. I stood a step below him, clutching a small ceramic bowl of clear water, water that I had claimed held the revealing agent. The Queen has told you the truth, Aron's voice boomed, vibrating through the stone floor. A murderer walks among us. They used a toxin that leaves a mark only a healer's eye can see. One by one, you will step forward. You will dip your hands into this basin. If you are innocent, the water remains clear. If you carry the stain of the black briar, you will not leave this hall alive. It was a bluff, a beautiful, high-stakes lie. Black briar doesn't stain, it doesn't smell. But guilt has a scent all its own to someone trained to watch the way a pulse jumps in a hollow throat. Begin, Aron commanded. The line started to move. One by one, the palace staff approached. A cook with flour-stained red hands, a stable boy with the scent of hay and horse sweat, a maid whose eyes were wide with a terror so genuine I knew she was innocent before her fingers even touched the water. I watched their faces. I watched the way their pupils dilated under the torchlight. I watched for the soldier's brace, the controlled breathing I had seen on Aron when he was dying. Watch, Eileen, Graham's voice whispered in my head. The truth is usually hiding in the things people try to keep still. 2 hours passed. My back ached, and the bowl in my hands felt like it was made of lead. The nobles were next. This was where the tension shifted. These were people trained in the art of the lie, wolves who had spent their lives masking their scents and their intentions. Lord Vane stepped forward, his throat still bruised from Aron's grip. He sneered as he dipped his long, spindly fingers into the water. It remained clear. He straightened his velvet tunic and stalked away without a word. Then came Brian. The heir walked with a casual, almost bored grace. He looked at the bowl, then at me. His eyes were cold, but there was something else there. A flicker of amusement? Or was it pity? A charming ritual, Eileen, he whispered as he reached for the water. But you're looking for a wolf in a room full of shadows. Sometimes, the shadow is the one holding the bull. He dipped his hands. The water stayed clear. He wiped his fingers on a silk handkerchief and moved to stand by the hearth, watching the rest of the line with an unsettling intensity. The line grew shorter. My hope was beginning to fray. If the bluff didn't work, Aron would have no choice but to resort to the violence the generals wanted. He would become the tyrant the prophecy feared. Then, I saw her. Alara, the head scribe's daughter. She was a quiet girl, barely 20, who spent her days in the royal library. She was the one who had brought me tea the first night I was in the palace. She was the one who had smiled at me when everyone else looked at me like a plague. As she approached the dais, her steps faltered. She wasn't looking at the bull, she was looking at Brian, and Brian wasn't looking at the fire anymore. He was looking at her, his jaw tight, his hand gripping the hilt of his ceremonial dagger until his knuckles turned white. Alara reached the bowl. Her hands were trembling so violently the water sloshed over the rim. "Step forward, Alara," I said softly. She didn't move. She looked up at Aron, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean—" He said it would just make him sleep. He said the kingdom needed a change. A collective gasp went through the hall. The guards stepped forward, their spears leveling. "Who told you that, Alara?" Aron's voice was a low, terrifying rumble. The girl's gaze flickered to Brian, then back to me. The man with the black feather. He said if I didn't do it, they would kill my father. He gave me the tea. He gave me the bolts. "Identify him," Aron commanded, stepping down from the throne. Alara turned, her finger rising to point toward the back of the hall, toward the shadows where the high priest stood. But before she could speak, a silver flash cut through the air. A dagger, perfectly thrown, buried itself in Alara's chest. "No!" I shrieked, dropping the bowl. It shattered on the stone, the magic water pooling around my boots. I lunged for her as she fell, my healer's instinct overriding the chaos that erupted in the hall. "Harlan, Voss, close the doors, no one leaves." Aron roared. I caught Alara before her head hit the dice. Blood was already blooming across her white linen dress, a deep arterial red. I pressed my hands against the wound, but I felt the cold vibration of the blade. It was coated in the same concentrated nightstalk that had killed Moira. "Alara, stay with me," I pleaded. "Who was it?" She gasped, her hand clutching my tunic. "Not Brian," she wheezed. The high priest, the old order, they've already begun." Her head fell back, her pulse flickered and died under my fingers. I looked up, my vision blurred with tears of rage. The high priest, the man who had been seconds away from lighting Aron's funeral pyre, was gone. A hidden door behind the tapestries stood open, a dark maw leading into the bowels of the palace. Aron was already at the door, his wolf surging beneath his skin, his eyes glowing like twin suns. He looked back at me, and for a second the bond was so loud it was a physical scream. "Stay here," his mind projected into mine. It wasn't a request, it was an alpha's command. "Aron, wait," I shouted. But he was already gone into the dark. I looked around the hall. The nobles were in an uproar. The guards were struggling to maintain a perimeter, and in the center of the chaos, Aron Scott was standing over Alara's body. He wasn't running. He wasn't fighting. He was staring at the girl with a look of such profound, shattered horror that the air around him seemed to freeze. "You knew her," I said, my voice cold. Brian looked up at me. There were no more smirks, no more calculations. She was going to be my mate, Eileen. We were waiting for the next moon to announce it. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The conspirators hadn't just used Brian's ambition. They had used his heart. They had forced the woman he loved to poison the king he was supposed to replace, ensuring that no matter who won, the Scott line would be destroyed by its own blood. "The high priest," I said, grabbing Brian's arm. "Where does that passage lead?" Brian blinked, the fog of grief clearing into a sharp, lethal focus. "The catacombs, under the Pyre courtyard. Eileen, if the high priest is there, he's not running, he's finishing the ritual." "The cinder bond," I whispered, remembering the prophecy. "The union will be a conflagration." "They don't want to kill Aron anymore," Brian said, his voice trembling. "They want to sacrifice you both. They think if they burn the king and his fated mate together, the power will return to the old blood." I didn't wait for a guard. I didn't wait for permission. I grabbed a torch from the wall and ran toward the dark passage. "Eileen, stop!" Brian shouted behind me. I didn't stop. I couldn't. The tether in my chest was no longer a pulse, it was a fire. Aron was in danger, and for the first time in my life, I didn't care about being a healer. I didn't care about being unranked. I was a mate, and the fire was coming for us both. The air in the catacombs tasted of damp earth and something far more sinister, ancient, stagnant magic. My torch flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the limestone walls as I sprinted deeper into the bowels of the palace. The tether was no longer a hum, it was a rhythmic, agonizing throb in my skull. I could feel Aron's heartbeat, erratic, violent, and fueled by a cold, murderous focus. Behind me, I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots. Brian was following, his breath hitching in the dark. "Eileen, wait!" he hissed, his voice echoing off the low ceiling. "The catacombs are a labyrinth. The high priest knows these tunnels better than any Scott. You're walking into a slaughterhouse." "He has Aron," I shouted back, not slowing down. I felt it. The bond, it's shifting. It's not just a connection anymore, Brian. It's a leak. He's losing himself to the wolf. I rounded a sharp corner and skidded to a halt. The tunnel opened into a vast, subterranean chamber directly beneath the funeral courtyard. Above us, the heavy iron grate that supported the ceremonial pyre was visible, moonlight filtering through the gaps like silver bars. In the center of the chamber stood the high priest. He had discarded his white robes for a tunic of raw, dark leather, his face painted with the gray ash of the old blood families. He wasn't alone. 6 hooded figures stood in a semicircle, their hands joined, chanting in a tongue that sounded like grinding stones. And in the middle of that circle was Aron. He was on his knees, his hands shackled to heavy iron rings set into the floor. His shirt was torn away, his back a roadmap of tension. He wasn't shifting, not yet. But his skin was rippling, his claws extending and retracting into the stone. A thick, ethereal smoke, the color of bruised plums, rose from a brazier at the high priest's feet, swirling around Aron like a living shroud. "The night stalk was the prelude," the high priest intoned, his voice unnervingly calm. "But the spirit bind is the finale. The Alpha King will not die today. He will simply become the beast his lineage suppressed, a feral god to tear his own kingdom apart." "Let him go," I screamed, stepping into the light of the brazier. The chanting stopped. The high priest turned, a slow, hollow smile spreading across his face. "The spark has arrived." Perfect. The prophecy did not say the mate must be willing, only that she must be present when the fire begins. Aron's head snapped up. His eyes weren't gold anymore. They were a void of shimmering black, the pupils blown wide until the iris vanished. He let out a sound. Not a growl, but a mournful, distorted howl that vibrated in my very teeth. "Eileen, run." The words weren't spoken. They slammed into my mind through the bond, frayed and bleeding. "I'm not leaving you," I whispered. "How touching," the high priest sneered. He raised a blackened silver dagger. "The unranked girl who thought she could fix a broken crown with herbs. You are the final ingredient, Eileen Murphy. The grief of a lost mate is the only thing powerful enough to snap an alpha's mind permanently." He lunged. I wasn't a warrior. I was a healer. I didn't have a sword, and I didn't have the strength of a wolf. But I had the attention. I saw the way he favored his left leg. I saw the slight tremor in his hand from the alchemical fumes. As he swung the dagger, I didn't back away. I stepped in. I ducked under his arm, my shoulders slamming into his ribs, and drove my thumb into the nerve cluster at his elbow, the healer's strike. His arm went numb, the dagger clattering to the stone. "Brian, now!" I yelled. Brian leapt from the shadows, his silver blade catching the moonlight from above. He collided with the hooded figures, a whirlwind of desperate, vengeful steel. But the high priest was faster than he looked. He recovered, swinging a heavy iron censer at my head. I ducked, the metal whistling past my ear, and scrambled toward Aron. "Aron, look at me." I grabbed his face, my hands feeling the unnatural heat of his skin. "Fight it. The smoke, it's an illusion. It's alchemist's fog mixed with night stalk vapor. It's lying to your senses." Aron's jaw snapped shut inches from my throat. His breath was hot, smelling of ozone and blood. He didn't recognize me. His wolf was at the surface, a raw, screaming force of nature that only saw a threat. The high priest laughed, kicking me away. I hit the stone floor hard, the world spinning. "It's too late, girl. The bond is a bridge, and I am burning it." He reached for the brazier, tipping the purple coals onto the floor. The smoke billowed upward, thick and suffocating. Above us, I heard the sound of wood groaning. The funeral pyre in the courtyard was being lit from above, the distraction for the city while the real murder happened below. Embers began to fall through the iron grate like orange snow. I looked at Aron. He was thrashing, the iron shackles groaning as he pulled against the floor. The smoke was filling his lungs, turning his blood to fire. If he shifted now, in this state, his mind would shatter. He would become the monster the old order wanted. "Attention, Eileen," Grams's voice echoed in the chaos. "Find the source. Close the wound." The source wasn't the smoke. It wasn't the high priest. It was the bond itself. The high priest was using the tether to funnel his own malice into Aron's mind. I stood up, my vision blurring. I didn't look at the high priest. I didn't look at Brian, fighting for his life. I looked at the shimmering, invisible cord that connected my heart to Aron's. It was frayed, turning a sickly, bruised black. I reached out, not with my hands, but with my spirit. I didn't try to pull him back. I pushed in. I opened every wall I had built. I showed him the border village. I showed him the smell of rain on the cedar trees. I showed him the moment I saw him breathing on that pyre and decided, for no reason at all, that his life was worth more than my safety. "I am here," I projected, my heart screaming. "I am the anchor. Follow my pulse." Aron froze. The black in his eyes flickered. A single streak of gold reappeared. "Eileen?" he rasped. "No!" The high priest roared. He snatched up the fallen dagger and charged at me, his face a mask of zealot's fury. I didn't move. I couldn't break the connection. I stood there, my arms wide, shielding the king who was finally finding his way back to me. The blade was inches from my heart when a heavy thud echoed through the chamber. Brian hadn't used his sword. He had used his body. He tackled the high priest, the two of them spiraling into the spilled coals of the brazier. A scream of pure agony tore through the room as the alchemical fire caught the high priest's robes. In that moment of distraction, the iron shackles snapped. Aron didn't shift. He exploded upward, his hand catching the high priest by the throat before the man could even scramble out of the flames. But Aron didn't kill him. Not yet. He turned his head, his golden eyes finding mine through the swirling ash and falling embers. "The fire is here?" Aron said, his voice deep and resonant, no longer distorted. The ceiling above us groaned. The massive cedar logs of the pyre were fully engulfed now, the heat becoming unbearable. The grate was glowing cherry red. We were in a furnace. "We have to go!" Brian shouted, dragging himself away from the charred remains of the hooded figures. "The structure is failing." Aron grabbed me, pulling me against his chest. His heart was steady now. It beat in perfect, rhythmic synchronicity with mine. "Hold on," he commanded. He didn't run for the tunnels. He looked up at the glowing iron grate. With a roar of pure alpha strength, he leaped, his fingers catching the red-hot iron. He didn't flinch at the burn. He used the momentum to kick through the weakened stone supports of the courtyard floor. We burst through the center of the funeral pyre like a phoenix rising from the ashes. The crowd in the courtyard screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. Thousands of people watched as their dead king emerged from the heart of the flames, carrying the unranked girl who had saved him once before. Aron stood in the center of the fire, the flames licking at his skin but failing to burn him. The cinder bond was real, but it wasn't a curse. It was a shield. He set me down on the scorched marble and turned to his people. His eyes were gold, his presence absolute. "The old order is dead," he shouted, his voice carrying to the furthest walls of the city. "The fire did not take us, it forged us." I looked at my hands. They were covered in soot and blood, but they were steady. I looked at Aron, and for the first time, I didn't see a king or a stranger. I saw my mate, but as the high priest's body was dragged from the ruins and Brian stood, panting beside us, I realized the truth. The conspiracy was broken, but the world was watching. And they were all looking at me. The nobody was gone. The queen had arrived, and she had a kingdom to heal. The morning after the catacombs didn't bring peace. It brought a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight on the city of Boise. The funeral pyre was a skeleton of charred cedar and twisted iron, a black scar in the center of the palace courtyard. Smoke still drifted in lazy gray ribbons toward the sky, smelling of spent ozone and the metallic tang of alchemical fire. I stood on the balcony of the royal suite, my hands bandaged where the heat had blistered the skin. I wasn't wearing silk or leather. I was back in my wool tunic, the one I had arrived in. It felt like a tether to the girl I used to be, the one who didn't have the fate of a kingdom resting on her shoulders. The door behind me opened. I didn't have to turn to know it was him. The bond hummed, a steady, warm vibration that had settled into a comfortable rhythm, like a second heartbeat. "The High Council is waiting," Aron said. His voice was quiet, stripped of the Alpha's roar. He looked tired, the shadows under his golden eyes darker than I'd ever seen them. He had a bandage across his cheek, a souvenir from the collapsing stone. "Let them wait," I said, staring out at the city. "They spent the night scrubbing the ash of the old order off their boots. They can spend the morning reflecting on why they let a priest turn their king into a sacrifice." Aron stepped up beside me, his shoulder brushing mine. The contact was grounding. "Brian has been cleared. He's changed, Eileen. He spent the morning in the infirmary, sitting with Alara's body. He's asked to be sent to the northern border. He says he wants to earn the Scott name before he ever looks at a crown again." "Good," I whispered. He was a fool, but he wasn't a monster. The high priest was the one who fed on the shadows. He used everyone's fear of the cinder bond to build his own pyre. Aron turned to me, his hand covering mine on the stone railing. "And you? Are you still afraid of the fire?" I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the man who had been willing to let his own mind shatter to save me. I saw the king who was terrified of being alone. And I saw the mate who had been searching for a ghost for 17 years. "I'm not afraid of the fire, Aron. I'm a healer. We use fire to cauterize wounds. We use it to forge tools. Fire isn't the end of the story, it's the transformation." He smiled, a rare, beautiful expression that reached his eyes. "The council wants an official coronation. They want to announce the fated mate bond with a ceremony that will make the last 3 days look like a village fair." "No," I said firmly. Aron blinked, his brow furrowing. "No? I am an unranked healer from the East, Aron. I saved your life because you were breathing wrong, not because I wanted to sit on a gold chair and watch people bow." I stepped closer, my fingers tracing the edge of his bandage. "If you want me as your mate, if you want me to stay, then we do this on my terms. No more secrets, no more prophecies, and no more nobodies." "Tell me," he said, his voice a low, devoted growl. "I want the royal apothecary opened to the unranked. I want healers from the border villages brought here to train the palace physicians who couldn't tell the difference between poison and a heart attack. And I want the high wilds recognized as sovereign territory, not a hunting ground for the old blood families." Aron let out a short, sharp laugh. "You're negotiating for a kingdom before. We've even shared a meal that wasn't interrupted by an assassination." "I'm a Murphy," I said, a spark of my old fire returning. "We're very practical people." He pulled me into his arms, his forehead resting against mine. The tether between us flared, not with the jagged heat of the catacombs, but with a deep, resonant glow. It was the feeling of a wound finally closing. "Whatever you want, Eileen, the kingdom is yours. I'm just the man lucky enough to stand beside you." An hour later, we entered the council chamber together. The atmosphere was vastly different from the last time I had stood here. There were no sneers, no whispered insults about bloodlines or rank. Lord Vane was gone, stripped of his lands and titles, currently awaiting trial in the dungeons. The remaining nobles stood as one, their heads bowed in a gesture of absolute submission. Aron didn't sit on the throne. He stood in front of it, his hand firmly clasped in mine. The old order spoke of a prophecy. Aron addressed the room, his voice echoing with an authority that brooked no argument. They spoke of a fire that would end the Scott line. They were right about one thing. The old world is gone. The era of rank and shadow has burned away. He looked at me, his eyes shining with a pride that made my breath hitch. "Eileen Murphy is not just my fated mate," he continued. "She is the healer of the Scott kingdom. She saved your king when your own traditions would have buried him alive. From this day forward, there will be no unranked. There will only be the people of this realm, and those who serve them." I stepped forward, looking at the men and women who held the power of the land in their hands. I didn't feel like a girl from a village anymore. I felt like the daughter of the woman of the Grey Pass. I felt like the legacy my mother had tried to hide. Finally standing in the sun. "We have work to do," I said, my voice steady and clear. "The poison in this city didn't just come from a bottle. It came from the walls we built between us. We're going to tear them down, one stone at a time." The council was silent for a long moment, and then, slowly, Lord Cale began to clap. The sound grew until it filled the chamber, a thunderous roar of approval that spilled out of the windows and into the streets of Boise below. A month later, the first caravan from the east arrived. It wasn't a merchant train. It was a line of wagons filled with herbs, books, and healers from the borders. Among them was a young woman who looked remarkably like Moira, her eyes wide as she took in the spires of the palace. I met them at the gate. I wasn't wearing a crown. I was wearing my healer's cloak, the one with the hidden pockets and the scent of lavender. Aron stood a few paces behind me, watching with that quiet, intense focus that still made my heart skip a beat. He had given up trying to make me a traditional queen. Instead, he had become the king who cleared the path so his mate could work. "You look happy," he said, walking up to join me as the wagons rolled into the courtyard. "I look busy," I corrected him, though I was smiling. "There's an outbreak of red cough in the lower districts, and the new apothecary wing is still missing its shipment of dried mint." He wrapped an arm around my waist, pulling me into his side. "I'll send a patrol to find the shipment." "You'll do no such thing, Alpha. You have a treaty to sign with the Northern Pacts." Aron sighed, but there was no bite in it. "Is this how it's going to be then? The Alpha King taking orders from a border healer?" I turned in his arms, looping my hands around his neck. I looked into those golden eyes, the eyes that had once looked at a funeral pyre with acceptance, and now looked at the world with hope. "It's not an order, Aron," I whispered, leaning in until our lips were inches apart. "It's attention, and you should know by now, I always pay attention." The kiss was slow, deep, and tasted of a future that was no longer written in ash. Around us, the city of Boise was alive. The sound of hammers on stone, the laughter of children in the streets, and the rhythmic beat of 1,000 hearts, all moving in sync. The Scott Kingdom was no longer a legacy of death. It was a living, breathing thing. And at the center of it all stood a girl who had stumbled into a fire to save a stranger, only to find that the person she was truly saving was herself.